And similarly, when some of those black students, including the ones from Brownsville, arrived at those schools, they were often sent to individual all-black classrooms, and most of them begged to go on and to stop this project. And there were other efforts as well to intervene in how schools would be zoned, and in each effort, the community efforts, civil rights efforts, were met with real intransigence. So in the face of that, in 1967, there was a collaborative effort between the Board of Education, the mayor at the time, who was John Lindsay, members of the Ford Foundation, and factions of this community in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and Brooklyn, who joined forces to try to create an experimental school district. And the idea was to have 8 schools that would be run by a local community board. And yet the debate over its specific powers, whether it could hire and fire, the degree of its control over its budget, whether it would control how it was that the schools would be evaluated, was actually never resolved. The school was taken apart, and the entire experiment was sort of shut down before those actual powers were delineated. But at the same time, for 2 years, these schools were run, right? And so what ended up happening was there was a group that had been pushing for community control, and they constituted an elected local governing board, right? And it did things like determine curriculum and said we run the schools, right? And yet there was a sense from the very beginning that there was a real tension between the teachers who had been in the school before it became the experiment and the people who were running it, right? And there were charges from the very beginning on the part of the teachers that there had been a black power takeover in the schools, right? And there were hoodlum elements who were running the schools. And the people who were running the schools, for their part, what they were trying to do were were fairly straightforward, kind of non-controversial things, right? They were asking, in schools where, in communities where schools consistently fail their students, should we try to do something about this? Don't we need to make these the center of communities, the sources of economic regeneration? And yet, what sort of pushed this to a real head was that there was also at the same time simmering a real conflict between the Board of Education and the United Federation of Teachers, which was predominantly a white Jewish organization. Right? And so, as the school year began, because what essentially happened is they set it up over the summer. They created a governing board, planned for the year. They consulted with its teachers, and the relationships became very hostile. But at the very start of the year, they transferred over. They requested a transfer over of a series of assistant principals and principals to the Board of Education. And the UFT, which had been battling with them already, branded them firings and immediately went on strike. Right? And one of the things that had led up to the conflict was that there was an unsettled contract between the United Federation of Teachers and the Board of Education at the time. And one of the specific issues that the United Federation of Teachers had been fighting for was greater rights of teachers to suspend and expel disruptive kids. And a lot of the civil rights groups, the community in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and black teachers throughout the city were incredibly opposed to this bill, because they saw it basically as giving more leverage for kicking out the very kids who needed to be better served by the schools. Right? And so the year when the school is to be run, what breaks out is a citywide strike, where the union is out on strike. And the community had decided that they would try to keep the schools running, and they did. They brought in parents, teachers from other parts of the city came in and worked there as well. And yet, but sort of the conflicts continue to sort of escalate. And what ended up happening in sort of the public perceptions of this was that Albert Shanker, who was the head of the union, claimed that there were basically hoodlum black power hoodlums running the school, and that what kids were being taught were black power slogans. Right? And McCoy, who was the director of the school for his part, had said, look, it's very clear there's a downward spiral going on in the quality of public education with kids of color in inner cities. And what we need to develop is a core of teachers who come from these communities and who see how they fare as their way of gauging the quality of our schools and of our nation. Because one of the concerns of a lot of parents was these schools could fail, and it didn't seem to make anyone lose sleep about how we as a nation, or we as a public school system, are faring. Right? And yet, one of the difficulties that McCoy and others encountered was that some of their staunchest critics were liberals and social democrats. Right? And one of the reasons why was they frequently sort of saw black power and assumed that black power was divisive, hostile, and violent, and that this wasn't, in fact, a project of community control. What it was a few individual people with a will to power who were seeking through these mechanisms to boost themselves up in ways that they considered to be deserved. Right? But in making that argument, one of the things that they failed to remember were all of the failed integrationist efforts that had led up to this point. Right? Because what they consistently said was they considered this as a first move rather than as a last resort. Because what people like McCoy reiterated again and again and again is that they've been trying through liberal mechanisms, through protests, through boycotts, et cetera, to make these, to achieve these ends. But it was precisely because they had failed that they had turned to the question of power. And yet all of the coverage of it assumed this was sort of a first resort rather than a last one. And that included, in terms of spokespeople, very prominent left-wing Jewish intellectuals, right? So if you look at some of the writing by someone like Hannah Arendt at the time, she was a staunch critic of efforts like these and the related ones that were going on at City College, right? And in some ways it was the failure of this community-controlled effort that led to the open admissions campaign around City College. But she said in both instances that what she saw going on was that this was an effort of black activists to deliberately lower standards. That their sort of moving into the system must have meant a lowering of academic standards. And she didn't understand why these efforts were being indulged. And similarly, Michael Walzer, who's also a left-leaning Jewish voice, a very prominent one, repeatedly described the politics of black power as a politics of gesture that quickly became lasting. And so what gathered around this event was a very particular way of narrating it, of saying what it was that had happened. And what struck me about it, and the reason I'm talking about it in this context, is that if you see the way that it was covered in the press, but if you also see almost all of the subsequent coverage of it, there's a real monopoly on who it is that appears as reasonable in this conflict. And it's very clearly a predominantly white Jewish union. The sense is that the union represented general interests. The union was caring for job security, whereas the sort of self-interested, narrow, particular black community was trying to undercut significant progress that the union had made. And it's worth also reiterating that the union itself had really, it had taken a while to gather the power that it had. By this stage, it was a powerful union, but this itself was a political victory, right? And so the union itself was very against decentralization as a policy, right? And community control implies decentralization. There's no way to have communities have control if you don't decentralize. And for members of the union, it was through centralization that they were able to lobby the Board of Education, that they were able to make advances, that they were able to create job security. So for them, this idea of having all of these different little bodies, each trying to control their own schools, for them reminded them of sort of board bosses, parochialism, and they saw it as a potential nightmare. Right? But what really shifted things and sort of made them take a horrible downward turn was where in the midst of, so you have to imagine sort of ongoing strikes, ongoing tension, insults being hurled back and forth, but then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, and I think we need to ask why it seemingly came from nowhere, these pamphlets emerged that were staunchly anti-Semitic, right? And they said things like, Black history is being taught in these schools, it can't be taught by Middle East blood-sucking exploiters. So it was pretty vicious stuff, and it was also really strangely written, where there are all these random capital letters in between. But the union got hold of these and made 500,000 copies and disseminated them all over the city. And said, basically, look what's going on in this school, look who you've empowered. There are people who are, what they managed to do was to twin black power with anti-Semitism, which is a twinning which continues to this day. There's assumption that the two must be intertwined, that black nationalism must mean anti-Semitism. And yet what was interesting about the conflict was that the school itself hired 350 new teachers, and over half of them were Jewish, right? They were younger, they were Jewish, yeah.
Way more than half. I'm from Brooklyn. I was in high school.
Okay.
I was a senior in high school that year.
Yeah.
Nearly all the whites across the picket lines were Jews.
Yeah. And the Jews who worked there were consistently spoke out in support of the community board.
Absolutely.
And the community board honored Jewish holidays, which wasn't a practice in any of the rest of the city. And they consistently tried to portray